Hello everyone. In my last video I solved the MCQ questions of Jan 21 Physics IAL Unit 4, and in this video I will be solving the other questions from question number 11 onwards. So let's begin. The question number 11 shows that we have two capacitors in parallel. We have one capacitor here and the other here, and we have a 6-volt supply of power. You will understand what the figure shows by reading the question, so I'm just giving you a summary what the question says. And the question asks us to find the total charge stored by the capacitors, the two capacitors, the total charge, right? And this is a very straightforward question, something easy to begin with. So there are two marks. The first mark is for using the formula Q is equal to CV. Here Q means charge, C means capacitance, and V means voltage. And our capacitance, we have two capacitors, so it is 32. And since it's a micro, so you have to put 10 to the power minus 6. Don't forget this 10 to the power minus 6 multiplied by the voltage. So this is not our answer. Be very careful. There are two capacitors, so this will store some amount of charge. This will store some amount of charge, the same amount of charge. So we multiply this value by 2, and the value that you should obtain is 3.84 into 10 to the power minus 4 coulombs. That's the amount of charge that you should be able to store in a capacitor. So don't forget to write this answer over here in your main exam. Next, question number B. Question number B asks us how much energy will be stored by the two capacitors. So yeah, you can do this question, you can solve this question using either of the three formulae. The formulae are half CV square, half QV, or half Q square by C. I'm not writing all the formulae, just telling you. I'll solve using the formula half CV square. Okay, since I know the capacitance, I know the voltage, I can just use half CV square. Just in case my this charge is not correct, so I better not use the formula that uses the charge. I'll use the formula that uses capacitance and voltage, because those two things are given by the question and they can't be wrong. So the total energy stored, I will use the formula half CV square, and I know that my capacitance for one capacitor is 32 microfarad, so 10 to the power minus 6, and my voltage is 6 square. And once again you have to multiply this value by 2 because there are two capacitors, and if there were three capacitors you would multiply by 3 and so on. The answer that you should obtain here is 1.15 into 10 to the power minus 3 joules. Don't forget to mention the units in your final answer, and also don't forget to write the final answer in the space given in the question. Moving on, here we have a situation where there is a drum. You can pause and read the question. So we have a situation where we have a drum. This is a drum of a washing machine, and when this rotates, the coin will also rotate, right? So um, they are asking us to find the maximum normal contact force, or the maximum normal reaction force. So what do they mean by maximum, and where can we find the maximum, where can we find the minimum contact force? So I think that this is the washing machine surface. It is spinning. Okay, it is spinning, and we know from our basic concept of centripetal force that if the coin is over here, then it will face a centripetal force towards the center. Centripetal means towards the center. So it will have a centripetal force towards this direction. And if it is here, it will have a centripetal force in this direction, and so on. Wherever it is, it will have a centripetal force. It will face a centripetal force from the washing machine surface towards the center. Now, the centripetal force, or the normal reaction force in all these four places are not the same. Okay. When the coin is in this direction, in this position, then a part of the centripetal okay, a part of the centripetal force is being provided by the weight of the coin itself. Okay, for example, if just for instance, I'm ignoring the actual value given over here. So just for example, if the coin has a weight of 1 Newton and the total centripetal force is 10 Newton, has to be 10 Newton, the total centripetal force. So the weight of the coin is already providing 1 Newton. The rest of the 9 Newtons has to be provided by the normal reaction force. Okay, and that is for this position. On the other hand, if the coin is in this position, then it needs the same amount of centripetal force, that is 10 newtons. It needs 10 newtons of centripetal force, but this needs the 10 newton centripetal force in the upward direction, right? In the upward direction. But the weight, this 1 Newton weight, is acting where? In the downward direction. In the downward direction. So now the normal reaction in this direction will first have to will have to counteract this weight. We'll have to counteract this weight, and then also have to provide the necessary centripetal force. So total amount of 11 Newton of normal reaction force is needed when the coin is in the bottommost position. So this is the concept behind, the minimum normal reaction force which is in this position, and the maximum normal reaction force which is in the bottommost position. And when the coin is in this position, there is the weight of the effect of weight is not there. The normal reaction force will be 10 Newton and 10 Newton respectively, here and here. So this entire 1 Newton, 10 Newton, 9 Newton thing was made up. It was not according to the question. Now we will go into the question itself. Okay, so they're asking us to find the maximum normal reaction force. Okay, so for maximum normal reaction force, we have to assume that the coin is in the bottommost position. So we have to add the centripetal force along with the weight of the coin. Okay, that will give the total normal reaction force. Okay, so for solving this problem, we'll need to know the speed, and then we can use the formula F is equal to mv square by r. But for knowing speed, we need to know the total um, the time period of rotation, the time period of revolution. Okay, we have the RPM here, and from there we have to find the time period. So the time period, or T, capital T, or time period, is 60 divided by 600. There are 600 revolutions per minute. Okay, so what is the time period? How much time does it take for one revolution? It takes 60 by 600. That is 0.1 seconds for one complete revolution. So we have a time period. Good. Next, we have to find the velocity. I'm using the linear velocity here. I'm not using the angular velocity. You can use the angular velocity as well. And that can be your exercise. You can use the angular velocity and see if you come at the same answer. So the linear velocity can be found using 2 pi r divided by t. The 2 pi r divided by t. 2 pi is the circumference and t is the time period, right? So 2 pi r. Do we know the yes, we know the diameter. We know the diameter. This is the diameter, not the radius. So in order to make it the radius, you have to divide this by 2. And in order to make this meter, you have to divide by 100. Okay? So you have to do two things. You have to divide by 2 to convert this diameter into radius. Then you have to divide by 100 to convert the centimeter into meter. That gives me 0.24 meters of radius divided by the time period, the one that we just found a while back, 0.1. That will give you the linear velocity of 15.1 meters per second. Okay. It is not necessary to write the units here, but it is just a reminder that whether you are using the SI units or not. Then we can use the formula F is equal to mv square by r to find the required centripetal force. This is not the normal reaction force. Okay, this is the required centripetal force, mv square by r. Okay, so the mass here is given in grams. Once again, be very careful. You have to convert this mass into kg. So 12 gram is 0.012 kg. I'm not going into the details of converting. You just have to divide this by 1000. And then the velocity that we found was 15.1. You have to square that out, and then divided by the radius. The radius is 0.24. That should give you 11.37 newtons. I'm writing in this area, but in your main exam you should not write in this area, as the question paper says. Okay, then we have found the centripetal force that is needed. Okay, now we also have to find the weight of the coin, because for the maximum normal reaction we have to add the weight as well as the centripetal force. So we need two things. We need two forces: the actual centripetal force that we need, and also the weight of the coin. So weight is equal to mg. Our coin's mass is 12 gram, which is 0.012 kg, and you have to multiply that by 9.81 mg. That will give you 0.12 newtons. That is the weight of your coin. Okay, now so finally the maximum normal reaction force, the maximum R max should be equal to the actual centripetal force that you need plus the weight. If you don't understand why I'm adding the centripetal force and the weight, please rewind and see this part that I explained over here, and that should give you a final answer of 11.49 newtons, adding the weight and the centripetal force. And once again, write this answer over here, and don't forget to write the units. Okay, a stationary antineutron decays by emitting a positron. Okay, so what happens is uh, we have an antineutron and it decays, and after the decay we have a positron. So as you can see, this circle is smaller than this circle. This is just to signify that the antineutron is heavier than the positron. The antineutron has more mass. Then what happens to the missing mass? That is basically what they're asking. Explain how the energy is conserved in this decay. So in this relativistic physics, we understand that mass and energy are interchangeable. Mass and energy are the different forms of the same thing. So when we talk about conserving energy, we're also talking about conserving mass, because mass and energy can be interchanged by one another. So what happens is, when this antineutron decays, it decays into a positron. So some of the mass decreases. What happens to the missing mass? When this decays, this positron gains some kinetic energy. So that energy plus this mass gives the total amount of mass of this antineutron. So the total mass of the antineutron is broken down into two parts: the kinetic energy of this positron plus the mass of the positron, the rest mass of the positron itself. Okay, so how do you write the answer? I'm not writing the answer because it is a very straightforward answer and does not waste much time by writing the answers. I'm just telling you, the first point that you should write is that although the mass of the antineutron is more than the mass of the positron has kinetic energy after the decay. So the missing mass is converted into the kinetic energy. That is point number one. The second point is how that energy is converted into how the mass is converted into kinetic energy. According to what formula? The formula is, you should have the formula. The missing mass is converted into energy according to this formula. Del E is equal to c square into del m. So this is the missing mass, and this missing mass is converted into this amount of kinetic energy. That is point number two. Okay. The equation shows the decay of an antineutron. So we have an antineutron. Explain how this equation shows the decay obeyed by the three conservation laws. So this question is an example of the fact that you have to know the charge, the baryon numbers, the lepton numbers of all these fundamental particles, and also you have to know what the names of each of these particles are. For example, this is an antineutron, and here we have an antiproton, then we have a positron, and then we have a neutrino. Okay. So the question is asking us that what conservation laws, the three conservation laws that this equation follows, we have to list them down. So the three conservation laws that this equation follows are the charge, baryon number, and lepton number. Lepton number. So these three each carry 1 mark. So this totally gives you 3 marks here. Just writing these three things that it follows these three laws, you are gaining 3 marks. The rest of the 3 marks you will gain by writing how each of these things are conserved. So moving on, charge. Let us see how the charge is conserved in this equation. Charge. See. So we're going to have two sides before the equation and after the equation. So for the for the an antineutron, we have a charge of 0. Antineutron has a charge of 0. Okay, so after the decay, let us see what is the total amount of charge that is remaining. So after the decay, the antiproton has a charge of -1. Okay, fine. Then the positron has a charge of +1, and the neutrino has a charge of 0. So the total amount of charge, -1 plus +1 plus 0, that totally gives us a total charge of 0. Okay, so I'm not writing the entire thing here, like the total charge is equal to 0. You should write that down, the total charge is equal to 0. And don't write these short forms, because if I explain and at the same time I write the full forms, the video will become very long. It will become very hard for you to follow the video. So I'm just telling the things, but I'm advising you not to use the short forms like this, like this number or TC. You write the whole thing, total charge. Okay, total charge is equal to 0. So as we can see, total charge before and after the collision is 0. Before and after the decay is 0, so the charge is conserved. If you want, you can box these two things that they are the same, so the charge is conserved. You write it like this. Okay, Next, let's move on to baryon number. Baryon number. Okay. So before the decay, we have the baryon number. The baryon number of the antineutron is -1. Okay. The baryon number of the antiproton is also -1. The baryon number of the positron is 0. The baryon number of the neutrino is also 0. So the total baryon number before the decay is -1. After the decay is also -1 plus 0 plus 0 is also -1. So -1, -1. So, so baryon number before and after the decay is conserved. I'm not writing the whole thing once again. You should write it down. The baryon number before and after the decay are the same. Bracket, you write -1. So the baryon number is conserved. We write it down. Next, let's move on to the lepton number. And lepton number. The lepton number of the antineutron, lepton number is 0. And the antiproton neutron lepton number is also 0. The positron lepton number is -1. And the neutrino lepton number is +1. So the lepton number before the decay is 0. The lepton number after the decay is 0, -1, +1. That is, finally it is also 0. So the lepton number before the decay and after the decay is same, that is 0. So the lepton number is conserved in the decay. And at the last line you write it down that therefore all the three conservation laws have been followed in this decay. All the three conservation laws are followed in this decay. You have to write the final conclusion like this nicely. Okay. So you can pause the video and read this question. This is a very interesting question. See, basically what happens is, I'll tell you the story, long story short. Basically, um, there, there is a height of 1600 meters from here to here. There is a height of 1600 meters, okay? 1600 meters, okay? The height is not important here. The height is important in your calculation, but there is a height, a big height. There's a mountain, the top of the mountain and the bottom of the mountain, the gap is 1600 meters. Now, we have muons that are observed here and muons that are observed over here. So it should take, we will see in the calculation that it should take 5.4 microseconds. Okay, it should take 5.4 microseconds for the muons to travel from here to here. We'll see in the calculation. Okay, I'm just giving a summary of what's going to happen. It takes 5.4 microseconds for the muons to come from here to here. But the problem is, the question says that the muons have an average life of only 2.2 microseconds. Okay, the muons only survive for 2 seconds. They only survive for this amount of time. Then how come they have been flying from here to here 5.4 for 5.4 seconds? Okay, the idea comes from the idea of relativity. We know when something is traveling faster, time goes slower for that body. So since the muons are traveling so fast, they're traveling at near the speed of light, they're traveling at 0.994 c, very close to the travel 99.4% the speed of light. So for them, time is slower, and therefore what we see as 5.4 seconds, there are, the time is much, it's much more longer for them. So they are surviving for the entire drop over here. Although 5.4 seconds pass for us, for them it barely passes 2.2 seconds from to come from here to here. And let us go to the calculation right now. Okay. First of all, you should mention that the idea of relativity, they're saying that the idea of relativity could be used to explain this idea. First of all, you have to read the whole question, and then they're asking us how these observations are consistent with the idea of relativity. The number one criteria of writing the relativistic equations are, or trying to explain something in terms of relativity, is that it has to travel close to the speed of light. Okay, or else the idea of relativity or the effect of relativity will be negligible. So the first observation that we have here is that their speeds are very close to the speed of light. 0.994 c, the speed that they have, is very close to the speed of light. I'm not writing the whole sentence, but you have to write the whole sentence. Okay, their speeds are very close to the speed of light. In bracket you write 0.994 c. Next, you calculate the time that it takes to travel from here to here, from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain. The time, we know time is equal to distance by speed. Okay, the distance is 1600 meters, and the speed is 0.994 c. C means the speed of light, that is 3 times 10 to the power 8. That should give you a time of 5.4 into 10 to the power minus 6 seconds, so 5.4 microseconds. Okay? But we know that this 5.4 microseconds, 5.4 microseconds is much larger than their lifespan, average lifetime. That is 2.2 microseconds, 2.2 microseconds. It's much larger. So how can this be explained? This can be explained using the fact that that since they're traveling very close to the speed of light, since they're traveling very close to the speed of light, since the particles, the muons, are traveling. Pardon my grammar. I'm just trying to make the point here. Since the particles are traveling close to the speed of light, close to the speed of light, if we write the full form, so the time is dilated. The time is dilated with respect to someone at rest. Okay, so the time is dilated, and therefore, although we are thinking that they're traveling for 5.4 microseconds, actually they are traveling somewhat very close to the 2.2 microseconds, their lifetime. So that is why most of them reach the ground. So that is why most of them reach the ground. So most of the muons reach the ground. Okay. After the muons were discovered in 1936, they were known for many years as mu mesons. Explain why the muons are not described as mesons in the standard model. Okay. Uh, if you read the chapter very carefully, you should know that the muons are fundamental particles. The muons are fundamental particles. But the mesons, on the other hand, they're made of quarks. We now know that the mesons are made of quarks. And so the muons, since they're fundamental particles, they're leptons, so they cannot be mesons because mesons are made of quarks. So these are the 2 points that you should write in your answers. The first point is, I'm just saying the points verbally. The first point is that the muons are leptons. Okay, the muons are leptons, and you can also add in the first point that the muons are actually the fundamental or elementary particles, leptons. The number 2 point is, on the other hand, the mesons are made of quarks and antiquarks, and that is why the muons are not described as mesons in the standard model that we use right now. Let us move on to number 15. In 1937, scientists at the University of California used high-speed particles from a cyclotron to produce isotopes of phosphorus. The isotope can be used in a treatment for cancer. Explain the role of the electric and magnetic fields in the production of high-speed charged particles by cyclotron. So basically they're asking us how the cyclotron produces high-speed particles. Particularly they're asking us how the magnetic field and the electric fields help in producing those fast particles. Okay. So these sort of questions, as you can see here, the star mark here. So your quality of written communication will be assessed. So you need to write the answer in a very systematic way, not necessarily in the way that I've written. Like you can use full sentences. You should use full sentences, but it will be better if you use points like this, so that you can show the examiner that you have used exactly 6 points or maybe even 7 or 8 points. The examiner can choose according to his wish which points he will take for your marking. So I've written here 6 points. I haven't written anything more. So these are my answers. The magnetic field. How does the magnetic field help in producing those fast particles? You see, the particles have to rotate, revolve, right, in the cyclotron. So the magnetic field actually rotates those particles. The magnetic fields are perpendicular to the particle motion. Okay, so as the particles move, they face a force due to the magnetic field, which is given by the formula F is equal to BVQ. Okay, the B is the magnetic field strength, V is the velocity, and Q is the charge of the particle. That this force is basically the centripetal force, and this centripetal force causes the particles to undergo circular motion like this. Okay, to undergo circular motion. Now, if they undergo circular motion, they will keep on moving in just one circle, right? How come they spiral? That happens because of the electric field. The electric field is present where the electric field is present between the two Ds. Here you can see the electric AC supply. So here is an electric field between these two Ds, just like this. Like there are two plates, and one plate is positive and the other plate is negative. So what happens is, for example, if there is an electron here, so just when the electron arrives over here, this part becomes positive and this part becomes negative. Then the electron is attracted towards this plate. Once again, when the electron reaches this point, then this plate becomes positive and this becomes negative, and this goes on, and the electron keeps on accelerating every time it comes to this gap. So how will we write the answer? The answer is the field between the D's change in direction every time the particle passes. That's what I've just shown. So this change in direction actually accelerates the particle, and so you can see the particle accelerates every half revolution. So every time it passes through the gap between the D, it accelerates, and this is why, because of this acceleration, its radius of circular motion increases. So the main purpose of the magnetic field is to turn the particle, and the purpose of the electric field is to accelerate the particle. Right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, so read the question. I'm just going to give you a summary. So what happens is, the cyclotron can accelerate the particles with kinetic energy up to 16 mega electron volt. Okay, so this amount of energy is provided. So there is the diameter of the cyclotron is provided, the mass of the alpha particle is provided. They want us to calculate the magnetic field intensity that the cyclotron needs to accelerate the alpha particle to this amount of energy. Okay. So what happens is, first of all, you have to calculate how much kinetic energy is given to those alpha particles. Okay, so here it is given 16 mega electron volt. So you have to convert it to joule. Okay, so the kinetic energy is equal to 16 mega electron volt. And how do you convert this mega electron volt to joule? Well, mega electron volt means, mega means what? Mega means 10 to the power 6. So this mega has been converted to 10 to the power 6. Okay. Now for this electron volt means 1.6 into 10 to the power minus 19. So this electron volt means 1.6 into 10 to the power minus 19. So the kinetic energy is 2.56 into 10 minus 12 joule. Don't write in this place in your main exam. Okay, you shouldn't write in this place. You should keep writing between the boundary. So this is the kinetic energy in joules. Now this same amount of kinetic energy will have to be given by the cyclotron. Okay, so this kinetic energy is equal to p square by 2m. So this 2.56 into 10 to the power minus 12 will be equal to p square by 2 into m. The mass of this alpha particle is 6.6 into 10 to the power minus 27. Okay, and if you don't know how to calculate the mass, there are 2 neutrons and 2 protons, and that's how you can have the mass of the alpha particle. So that will give you the momentum of 1.8 times 10 to the power minus 19 Newton seconds. Okay, now we will use the formula R is equal to P by BQ. Okay, so R, we need to calculate the value of the magnetic field strength. So this B is unknown. We know the R, the diameter of the cyclotron has been given 0.94. So that the diameter is given, so you have to convert it to R by dividing this by 2. You have to be very careful. This is not the radius, this is the diameter. So divide this by 2 and you get the radius. The radius becomes 0.47. And the P we know, 1.8 into 10 minus 19, and divided by B. The B is unknown, and the Q. Q means the charge of the alpha particle. There are 2 protons in the alpha particle, so 2 times the electronic charge. That is the charge of the alpha particle. Now, calculating all these things, you will find an answer which should be 1.2 Tesla. Don't forget the unit in your answers. Another theoretical question. So I have written the answer beforehand. Basically, what happens is you can pause and read the question, but I'll give you a summary. What happens is here's a coil here, and this coil is in a closed loop, so current passes through this coil, but the current is not constant. The current is initially zero, and the current gradually increases. Due to the increase in this current, due to the increase in the current in this coil, current is induced in this plasma, in this tokamak. Okay, the current is induced in this plasma. So they're asking us how this is possible, how changing the current in the coil can cause the current to be induced over here. So let's see how that happens. We all know that the current in the coil will produce a magnetic field in the coil. We know that. So if you change the current, the magnetic field will also change. So changing the current magnitude, like increasing the current from 0 to a maximum value, means what? Changing the current. So changing the current means the magnetic field produced by this current is also changing. And we know that since the magnetic field is changing, so the magnetic flux linkage with the plasma is also changing. And the rate of change of magnetic flux linkage is directly proportional to the EMF induced, that is Faraday's law of electromagnetic induction, and therefore EMF is produced in this plasma. Just because an EMF is produced doesn't mean that current will flow. For current to flow in a circuit, the circuit has to be complete. If the circuit is broken like this, then current will not flow. So EMF is induced, good, but if the circuit is not complete, then current will not flow. But fortunately here the circuit is complete in the plasma, the circuit is complete, so the current flows. The mathematical question, okay. The plasma can be considered to be a cylinder of length 13.2 and cross-sectional area 2.3. Show that the resistance of the plasma is this much. Okay. So we have resistivity given here. So we have one clue that we have to use the formula R is equal to resistivity times length divided by area. So the resistance is what we have to calculate. So let's keep the equation like this. The resistivity rho is given here 3.3 times 10 minus 8. Okay. And we know the length? Yes, we know the length, that is 13.2. And we know the area? Yes, we also know the area. So this is basically a very easy question to give you some marks and get you confident. So everything is given. The length is given, A is given, resistivity, everything, all the three things are given. You just have to use the formula and calculate the answer. The final answer of resistance should be 1.89 times 10 minus 7. There is something that we're missing here. Yes, the unit. Right. Now, in a particular experiment, the current in the central coil is increased steadily from 0 to maximum value in a time of 25 seconds. Okay. So the current is increased from the 0 value to a maximum value in a time of 25 seconds. Okay, nice. When the current, let's mark this. If you don't, you will not have a red pen in the exam. You shouldn't use a red pen in the exam. So you can use your pencil or pen to mark your data like this. When the current in the central coil reaches maximum, the magnetic flux linkage with the loop is this much. Okay. So basically what? Basically, for the magnetic flux to increase from 0 to 16.9, it takes 25 seconds. Okay. Calculate the heating power produced in the plasma. Okay. First of all, let us find out the EMF induced. Okay, the EMF induced. EMF is the rate of change of magnetic flux linkage. So how much is the magnetic flux changing? Well, the final magnetic flux is 16.9 and the initial magnetic flux was 0 since the current was 0. So we know that the magnetic flux initially was also 0. How much time has been taken for this process? 25 seconds. So the induced EMF is 0.676 volt. Okay, this much is our induced EMF. Then you can use the formula I is equal to V by R in order to calculate the current that is produced in the plasma. So the voltage, do we know the voltage? Do we know the voltage? Yes, we have just calculated the voltage. So 0.676 divided by the resistance. We have also calculated the resistance in our previous part of the question. So just bring the resistance from there, from the other part 1, and that should give you a current of 3.58 mega amperes. Okay, so that's a lot of current. and using that we can calculate the heating power in the plasma. How? Power is equal to IV. Okay, so remember, for electrical power you need IV or I square R or V square by R. So you need any two from I, V and R. So here we have V, here we have I. So using these two we can calculate power. So power is equal to IV. So 3.58 mega. Mega means what? 10 to the power 6. That much is our current. The voltage is 0.676. So this should give you a total power of 2.42 times 10 to the power 6 watt. So you can write it as 2.42 megawatt. 10 to the power 6 means mega, so you can write it as megawatt. Although this will also suffice. And don't forget to write your answer over here, and don't forget to keep the units. Okay, so here we have an impulse question. If you want, you can pause and see what's going on. I will give you a summary. So basically what happens is one of the pucks is given a velocity of 0.35 meter per second from rest in a time of 2.8 seconds. So the initial velocity was 0 of one of these pucks. Okay, the final velocity is 0.35. Okay, and how long did it take to increase the velocity from 0 to 3.5 by pushing? It took 0.28 seconds. Okay, it took 0.28 seconds, and we also know the mass of the puck. So they're telling us to calculate impulse. Okay, calculate using the idea of impulse. They are telling us to find the average force, not the impulse. Calculate using impulse the average force. So we need to calculate the average force that has been used to increase the speed of the puck from 0 to 3.5 meter per second. Okay, so let us see. So they have told us to use the idea of impulse. How can we equate impulse and force? Well, impulse is basically impulse is basically the change in momentum, and impulse itself has an expression that is force times time, force into time. The change in momentum is given by what? The final momentum minus the initial momentum, or mv minus mu, final momentum minus initial momentum. So the force we don't know, the time we know 0.28, we know the time. And do we know the mass? Yes, we know the mass, that is 110 grams. So we need to convert this to kg, remember. So 0.11 kg into the final velocity, that is 0.35, minus the initial momentum, that is 0.11 into initial velocity, that is 0. So the whole thing becomes 0. That should give you a final force of 0.14 Newton. Write your answer here and don't forget the units. Right, now we have a classic situation. This is a very common math. You should have practiced it in the books and while solving other question papers. So we know the initial velocity of puck 1. We know the initial velocity of puck 1, that is 0.41. So this is the initial velocity of puck 1. So U1, okay? And this is the mass of puck 1. So M1, puck 2, mass M2. The final velocity of puck 1. So final velocity of puck 1, so V1. So I have read the question before, so I have. It didn't take much time for me to label this U1, M1, M2, and V1. But when you get the question, before applying the law of conservation of momentum, you should first identify what is your M1, M2, U1, U2, V1, V2. Okay, M1, M2, U1, U2, and V1, V2, because you will need these three parameters in your equation. So according to the law of conservation of momentum in a particular direction is always conserved, okay, in a particular direction. So the total horizontal momentum before collision is equal to the total horizontal momentum after collision. Okay, so initial horizontal momentum is equal to final horizontal momentum. So I'm writing H here, but in your main exam paper you should write horizontal, and P you can use. P is the symbol of momentum, but you should write the full form of horizontal. I'm just writing this to save time. So in the initial horizontal, the total initial horizontal momentum, okay, of the system, not of any particular puck, of the entire system's initial momentum, the total system's final momentum. Okay. So what is the initial momentum of the total system? Okay, m1 u1 plus m2 u2. That is the total initial momentum. The final momentum is what? m1 v1 plus m2 v2. Mind it, we are only concerned with the what? The horizontal momentum. So we need to take the horizontal components of all these velocities, okay? So um, m1, the mass of Pak 1 is 110. Its initial velocity was 0.41, okay? Initially, the Pak 2 was at rest, so u2 is 0, so m2 u2 is also 0. Okay, m1 after collision, the mass of Pak 1 110. Now, the mass of velocity of Pak 1 after the collision was 0.28 meter per second. But the component of the velocity in the horizontal direction was 0.28 into cos 49. Okay, remember that we have to take the horizontal component of this velocity. Okay, since we're conserving the horizontal momentum only. Now, m2, the mass of the second Pak is 130, and the final velocity, oh, that is what we're actually finding, v2. So v2, we also have to take the horizontal component of this Pak, so cos 43. If you don't understand how this equation came about, please rewind and see this portion again. So the fundamental step for solving this sort of equations is writing these two steps: initial momentum is equal to final momentum, and writing this and remembering that we have to take component along a particular direction. In this scenario, we took the momentum along the horizontal axis. You could also do the same math using conservation of the vertical direction momentum, and the same answer you should have the same answer. So that should give you a final velocity of Pak 2 to be 0.26 meters per second. Deduce whether this was an elastic collision or not. Well, an elastic collision is something is a collision where the total kinetic energy before and after the collision are the same. Okay, so let us see before collision what was the kinetic energy before. Before the collision, the kinetic energy was half m1 u1 square. The second Pak wasn't moving, so u2 is 0, therefore the kinetic energy of the second Pak is also 0, so I'm not writing it. So plus 0, just like to explain that we do have a second Pak and that has a 0 kinetic energy. So m1, oh, one thing I forgot to mention, here you will notice that I've taken the masses in grams. I haven't converted them to kg. Why? Because if I divide, for example, see here, if I divide this mass by 1000, okay, I divide this mass by 1000, I divide this mass by 1000. So what you can do, you can take the 1000 common from here, and then you can cancel this 1000 with the other side. So when you have the same mass, the same parameters on both sides, you have masses on both sides. You can use any any type of mass, kg, gram, you can use any type of mass. But here we have to use the SI unit, the mass, so 0.11, okay, and its initial velocity was 0.41. Don't forget to square. That should give you 0.0092 joule. This is the total kinetic energy before the collision. Now after the collision, the total kinetic energy was half m1 v1 square plus half m2 v2 square. See how this m1 v1 values are helping you. So if you mark them beforehand, the math will become very easy for you. So half m1, we have to use the SI unit, so 0.11. The final velocity was 0.28 square plus half m2, that is 0.13. The mass of the second Pak 0.13, it was given in the previous page, and its velocity we just found to be 0.26 in our answer. So adding these two will give you the total kinetic energy of the system after the collision to be 0.0044 joule. As you can see that the kinetic energy after the collision is less than the kinetic energy before the collision. So the kinetic energy has not been conserved. So kinetic energy not conserved, not conserved. So in elastic collision, in elastic collision. Explain the assumption made when applying the principle of conserved momentum. Well, this is a common question. What assumption did you take? And this is a very common answer as well, that we assume that there are no external forces. This is a very common answer, but why? This is what they asked here. Why is this assumption important? So first of all, since there are 2 marks, the first mark is in stating the assumption itself. Yes, there are no net external forces, and then explaining why this assumption is important. Well, if there is a net external force, then there will also be an impulse, because impulse is equal to what? Force into time. So a net external force means what? There will be an impulse. This impulse is equal to what? Change in momentum. So if there is an external force, there will be an external impulse. And if there is an external impulse, there will be a change in momentum. So the momentum of my system will change anyway, even with or without the collision. Therefore, if there is an external force, there will be an external impulse, and that impulse will change the momentum of the system, and so the system's momentum will not be conserved. And therefore, we have to assume that there is an external net force in the collision. Okay, here we have another math. Take a moment to pause and read the entire question. This is a tricky one. There are 5 marks. You have to design the math very nicely and then do the math by yourself. So there are a lot of equations involved. Okay, simple equations, but a lot of equations you have to work through. So take a moment and see how you can do the math. Right. So here they're asking us that if an alpha particle, okay, if an alpha particle is fired at 1.74 times 10 to the power 7 meters per second towards this gold nucleus, then what will be its maximum acceleration? Well, this much you should be able to identify or recognize that the alpha particle is positive, this nucleus is positive. So the closer the particle comes to the nucleus, the more force it will face, the more repulsive force it will face. So the closer it comes, the more repulsive force it will face, and the more acceleration it will face. Okay, so that is what they're asking. What is the maximum acceleration? In other words, they're asking us what will be the acceleration of the particle when it is in this portion, because this is the portion that is closest to the nucleus, and at this point the force will be maximum, the acceleration will also be maximum, and this is the location of the maximum acceleration. Okay, so you can notice here that this is the place where the alpha particle comes to rest. Well, actually it doesn't follow this path. It just goes like this and comes back like this. If it follows a linear path, but just for our understanding, it just showed that it comes through this path and goes and takes a U-turn. But it never takes a U-turn. It just comes like this, comes to rest, and then again it rebounds. Okay. So let us first find out how much kinetic energy this alpha particle initially had. So initial kinetic energy. Okay. I like to make points like this, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so initial kinetic energy is equal to half mv square. I'm not writing the equation. You should write the equation though. Half mv square, m is 6.64 times 10 minus 27 v square, that is 1.74 times 10 raised to the power 7 square. That should give you a total kinetic energy of 1.01 times 10 to the power minus 12 joule. This is the amount of kinetic energy that the particle had over here. So as it comes to this point, it will lose all of that kinetic energy. Okay, it will lose that kinetic energy to what? Electric potential energy. So the change in kinetic energy is equal to the gain in electric potential energy. So the change in kinetic energy is it will lose all of its kinetic energy as it comes to this point. Okay, since it directly comes in line with the nucleus center, so it will come completely to rest. So the change in kinetic energy is what? 1.01 times 10 to the power minus 12 minus 0, or you can just ignore the 0. The entire kinetic energy has been changed to electric potential energy. So I've put the entire value of the kinetic energy over here. So the change in electric potential energy is what? Well, we know that electrical work is equal to V into Q. Okay, V is what? We know a formula for V. The formula for V is Q. Let's take some other Q. Q divided by 4 pi epsilon naught R times Q. So this Q is the Q of our alpha particle, and this Q is the Q which our alpha particle approaches. That is, this charge is the charge of the gold nucleus. So this is the amount of energy, this is the amount of work, electrical energy absorbed by our alpha particle as it comes close to the nucleus of gold over here. So this charge is the charge of our gold nucleus. So the charge of gold nucleus is what? There are 79 protons in the gold nucleus, so 79 into 1.6 times 10 to the power minus 19. Okay. Divided by 4 pi epsilon naught, the value of epsilon naught you should get in the data booklet, 8.85 times 10 to the power minus 12 into r. R we don't know. R is what? R is basically this distance between the alpha particle and this gold nucleus center, R. So that we don't know yet. So we will leave it like this, times the charge of our alpha particle. So there are 2 protons in the alpha particle, so 2 times 1.6 into 10 to the power minus 19. This is the charge of alpha particle. So this is this capital Q, and this small q is this. Okay, that should give you um, a distance of 3.6 into 10 to the power minus 14 meters. Minus 14 meters, 14. So this is the distance. So this is the minimum distance between our alpha and the gold nucleus. Now, using this distance, we can find out how much is the electrical repulsive force between these two particles. Using what formula? Using that formula, F is equal to Q1 Q2 by 4 pi epsilon naught r square. Okay. So our Q1 is our gold nucleus, 79 into 1.6 into 10 to the power minus 19. Our Q2 is our alpha, so 2 times 1.6 into 10 to the power minus 19. And 4 pi epsilon naught, our epsilon naught is 8.85 times 10 to the power minus 12 r square. So we now know the r, that is 3.6 times 10 to the power minus 14 square. Don't forget the squares and everything, okay? And that should give you a total force, the repulsive force at this point, at this instant, to be 28.1 newtons. We know the force, we know the mass of our alpha particle. We can find out the acceleration using F is equal to ma. So our force is 28.1. The mass of our alpha particle we know 6.64 times 10 minus 27 a, and your final acceleration value should be 4.23 times 1027 meters per second square. So as you can see, we have used a lot of equations over here. So you have to plan your way through. I prefer doing these maths at the end of the exam, like leaving this sort of creative math for the end of the exam and getting done with the easy ones at first. Although this strategy varies from person to person, so don't take it. Take it as a formula. Well, here we have another situation where another alpha particle has been fired, but this time the alpha particle has not been fired like directly along the axis of the gold nucleus. In your previous example, the alpha particle came directly like this. It came at to a stop at this point, and then it took a U-turn, like it just reversed its direction and went back. It never really reached the gold nucleus. So okay, but this time the alpha particle was actually fired like this. It never really came to rest. It just came here, slowed down for a bit, and then it um, flew at a different direction. So they're asking us whether the maximum acceleration here will be the same as the maximum acceleration beforehand. So let us find out. Well, for this alpha particle, the alpha particle that we have here for this question, all of its kinetic energy actually is not converted to electrical potential energy. Right? While it is still here, it still has some kinetic energy. It is moving all the while. It is moving along this entire path. Although its velocity is a little slow over here, but it is moving along this entire path. But here, in a previous example, in a previous situation, the alpha particle came to a complete rest. So all of its kinetic energy was converted to electrical potential energy. But for this particle, not all of its kinetic energy is converted to electrical potential energy. So since it does not have that much electrical potential energy, so it does not come as close to the gold nucleus. And since it doesn't come as close to the gold nucleus, it does not face that much repulsive force, because the closer you go to the gold nucleus, the more force you feel. So it doesn't go as close to the gold nucleus, so it faces less force. Less force means less acceleration according to Newton's second law of motion. Next, basically they're telling us to prove this equation. Okay, they haven't provided us with any information. We have to figure it out by ourselves. Basically, we have to use the situation where a droplet is falling. with a terminal velocity. So what happens is the earth is constantly pulling this droplet with its own weight, right? But what happens is, since it's falling through the fluid will try to give some resistance to its motion. So there will be some viscous drag d. So when it is at terminal velocity, the weight and the viscous drag are balanced. Therefore, it is not accelerating and hence a constant terminal velocity. So terminal velocity, the viscous drag is equal to weight. Viscous drag's formula is 6 pi r eta v, and the weight's formula is mg. Mg means what? M can be broken into volume into density. The volume of the spherical droplet is 4 by 3 pi r cube. Okay, and using this equation, by doing some algebraic manipulation, you can prove that r is equal to this. You can cut this r and r here, and there will be r square, and then you can prove this. Right. For this question, this is actually very easy. They have given us everything. They have given us all the information. Well, the rule is to calculate the radius of this oil droplet. Okay, so let's see if we know all the information. So we need to calculate the radius. We need the value of the viscosity. Yes, we know the value of viscosity, and we need to know the velocity. Yes, the velocity is given here. We know the velocity. We need to know the density. Yes, the density is also given here, so the density we know, and the value of g also we know to be 9.81. So just plug in all this information and calculate the value of the radius. The value should be 2.25 times 10 to the power minus 6 meters. Okay, so this is another situation where the weight of the droplet is balanced, but this time not through viscosity. This time it is balanced through electrical force. So once again we will use that same principle, that the weight is equal to the electrical force. Okay, so what is the weight of this particle? The weight will be mg. The weight will be mg. Okay, and the electrical force will be E times the Q. Okay, E times the charge. So mg, we know the mass of this particle. The mass of the particle is 3.03 times 10 to the power minus 14. The mass has been given. The value of g we know, 9.81. Okay, but the value of E we don't know. We only know the voltage and we know the separation. How can we find out E using V and separation? Yes, E is equal to V by D. V by D. So using that, we can find the value of E, V by D. So our V is 9910 and our D is 1.6 centimeter. We have to convert this to meter, mind it. So 0.0160, that is our E, V by D. And yes, finally we have to multiply the charge. Okay, so this charge, this has a charge of, oh, the charge is what we're actually finding, right? So the charge is unknown, and our charge will turn out to be 4.8 times 10 to the power minus 19 coulombs. Okay, the teacher says that charge can only be transferred in integer multiples of 1.6 times 10 to the power minus 19. Why is that? Because charge is something that is carried by electrons. So if you have an excess of electrons, there is a negative charge. If there is a deficit, there is positive charge. So the first imbalance of charge ever happens when you remove one electron or add just one electron to a neutral system. So the amount of positive or negative charge you have will be always formed by what? The removal or the addition of electrons. Therefore, the removal or addition of 1.6 times 10 to the power minus 19, since this is the charge of the electron. And therefore, all the charge that we will see in our universe will always be this proportion, this multiple of the electron. Okay, ignoring the situations of subatomic particles, of course. Okay, so let us see how this graph supports the teacher's claim. As you can see from the graph, all these charges, okay, all these charges are almost integer multiples of 1.6 times 10 to the power minus 19. These are integer multiples of 1.6 times 10 to the power minus 19, if you see carefully. Also, another fact is that, well, this could be this one of the charges could be a multiple of 1.6 times 10 minus 19, but here almost all of them are the multiples of 1.6 times 10 19, and the deviation is also small. The curve is not like this. The curve is not like this. The curve is sharp, which means the charge is actually this much. The charge is this much. There is small deviation. So this is very accurate. So the deviation is small. And how can you explain the deviation? Since there are 3 marks, you also have to explain how this deviation is happening. So this deviation could be due to the experimental errors. You have learned a lot of experimental errors in Unit 6. So yes, this does support the teacher's claim. You need to um, state your conclusion. Okay. Finally, in 1909, Millikan concluded that the charge in the electron was this much. But now we know that the charge is this much. This could be because the value of the viscosity of air used by Millikan was incorrect. Deduce whether the value of a viscosity was too large or too small. Okay. So first of all, you need to use this equation. Using this equation, you have to work your way out. So let us first try to see what happens if the viscosity used by Millikan was too small. Okay. So if the viscosity was too small, then the R calculated value of R will be too small. If the value of R will be too small, the value of the weight will be too small, since weight is equal to 4 by 3 pi r cube into g. So that pi r cube, the weight is directly proportional to r cube. So if the R is small, the weight will also be small. If the weight is small, we calculated the value of Q to be that value using this equation, right? Weight is equal to the electric force. So if the weight is too small, the calculated value of Fe will also be too small. And since F is equal to E times Q, if F is too small, the value of the Q calculated will also be too small. So finally, you can conclude that if the value of the viscosity is too small, the calculated value of Q will also be too small. Okay, so not necessarily that you will come to the correct conclusion in the first go, but if you had assumed that the value of viscosity was too high, then you would come to the conclusion that the value of Q would be too high, and you could just use counter argument to prove that okay, so the value used by Millikan was too small, therefore the charge deduced was too small. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.